A man can build a house for himself, but it takes another soul to make it a home. It is a quiet truth, discovered not in the grand gesture or the shouted vow, but in the space between two breaths in a darkened room, in the weight of a hand offered not to possess, but to steady. This is a story of that space, and of the courage it takes to step into it, to trust the floorboards will hold, and to find, in the lamplight of a shared kitchen, that you were never truly meant to be alone. Elias Thorne measured his days in the ring of his hammer and the cooling of iron. From the first gray light that filtered the smithy's high, dusty window to the last ember he banked in the forge, his life was a testament to order. His small house, attached to the back of the smithy, was as Spartan and controlled as his workshop. A single plate, a single cup, a single chair pulled up to the small plank table. Each evening he would wash them, dry them, and set them back in their precise places. He would read a page or two from a worn book on metallurgy, his finger tracing the lines of text as if seeking a logic the world of men had failed to provide. Then he would blow out the lamp and lie down on a bed made for one, listening to the silence press in. It was not a peaceful silence. It was a hollow one, the kind that echoed with the ghosts of unspoken words and the memory of a life before he had chosen his solitary penance in the dusty frontier town of redemption. He had come here to be useful and to be left alone, and he had succeeded at both. His hands, calloused and sure, could mend any broken thing, a wagon wheel, a plowshare, a child's bent toy, but he never touched anyone. His movements were economical, his words spare. He listened more than he spoke, his gray eyes missing nothing, a habit from a time when a flicker of movement in the brush could mean the difference between life and death. Now he watched the townsfolk from a distance, observing their chaotic, interconnected lives with a blacksmith's patience. He saw their needs, their follies, their small joys. He saw, and he kept his distance. The walls of his smithy, solid and forged in his own fire, were not the only ones he had built around himself. Elara Vance measured her days in stitches and the sharp, clean scent of lye soap. She had a small room at the back of Mrs. Gable's boarding house, just large enough for a cot, a washstand, and the sewing box that held her entire inheritance. She had arrived in redemption with nothing but a needle, a thimble, and a spine made of steel. Her past was a locked room, the key long since thrown away. Here she was a seamstress, a laundress, a woman of quiet industry and impeccable reputation. A reputation she guarded with the ferocity of a she-wolf, for she knew it was the only currency that mattered. It was all that stood between her and the kind of vulnerability she had sworn she would never know again. Dignity was her shield, and autonomy her most precious possession. That afternoon, the summer heat pressed down on the town, thick and suffocating. The air was still, promising a storm. Elara was returning from the mercantile, a small parcel of thread clutched in her hand, when Mr. Sterling stepped from the shade of the overhang, blocking her path. He was the town's wealthiest man, and he wore his entitlement like a well-tailored coat. "Miss Vance," he said, his voice a little too smooth, his eyes lingering a little too long, "a woman like you shouldn't be burdened with such labors. A word from me, and you could have a much more comfortable life." The offer was as plain as it was insulting. "I am quite comfortable. Thank you, Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice polite but cool. She tried to step around him. He shifted, blocking her again. "Don't be proud. I am a generous man." Just then, the first fat drop of rain struck the dust at her feet. The sky, which had been a hazy white, was now a bruised purple. A gust of wind tore down the street, kicking up grit and whipping her skirts around her ankles. She used the distraction to finally move past him, her heart hammering a protest against her ribs. The storm broke with a sudden, violent fury. The world dissolved into a blinding sheet of water. She ran, her parcel held tight, seeking any shelter. The nearest light was a warm, orange glow from the open door of the town smithy. She ducked inside, gasping for breath, the roar of the rain on the tin roof deafening. And then a sound of panicked scrabbling from a pile of burlap sacks. A stray dog, half-drowned and terrified, bolted past her. She yelped, stumbling backward over a discarded anvil stand. Her feet went out from under her. She fell hard, her head striking the packed earth floor. The world swam and went dark. Elias, drawn by the crash, found her there. She was unconscious, soaked to the bone, her simple cotton dress torn at the shoulder. His first instinct was clinical. Check for breath, for injury. Her pulse was a frantic bird beneath his fingers. Leaving her in the wet dress was unthinkable. The fever would take her. Moving with a grim, practiced efficiency he had learned in field hospitals, he carried her into his house. He laid her on his bed, his mind a fortress of necessity. He had to get her out of the wet clothes. It was a practical matter, nothing more. He worked with averted eyes, his touch impersonal, his focus on the task. But as he drew a dry blanket over her, covering the pale skin of her shoulder and the vulnerable curve of her neck, the front door rattled. Mrs. Gable, the town's foremost purveyor of gossip, stood there, her own bonnet dripping. "Mr. Thorne, such a storm. I saw your light and thought perhaps." Her eyes widened, taking in the scene. The town's reclusive blacksmith, standing over the bed where the town's most proper seamstress lay, clad only in her shift and the blanket. The woman's mouth opened, a silent O of perfect, righteous scandal. The silence in the room was no longer hollow. It was damning. The storm passed, leaving the air clean and the town buzzing. Mrs. Gable's story, embellished with each retelling, spread faster than fire in a dry field. Elara Vance, that quiet, proud woman, found in a state of undress in the blacksmith's bed. By noon, Elara, who had woken with a throbbing head and a cold knot of dread, could not walk to the well without feeling the scorch of speculative stares and the chill of whispered condemnation. Her reputation, the shield she had so carefully forged, was shattered. Mr. Sterling saw his chance. He found her outside the boarding house, his expression a smug pantomime of concern. "My dear Miss Vance, a terrible business. But I can make it right. Marry me. My name will silence these vicious rumors. I will protect you." The offer was a cage disguised as a sanctuary. She saw the predatory gleam in his eyes, and her stomach turned. Later that day, Elias came to her. He did not approach her on the street or make a public spectacle. He knocked on the boarding house door and asked for her with a quiet formality that made Mrs. Gable purse her lips. They stood in the small, stuffy parlor, the air thick with the scent of beeswax and hypocrisy. Elias did not waste words. He stood straight, his hands clasped behind his back, his gaze direct. "Miss Vance," he began, his voice a low rumble. "What they are saying is an injustice. It was my house. The fault is mine." Elara met his gaze, her chin high. "The fault is a storm and a stray dog, Mr. Thorne. Nothing more." "It doesn't matter what is true," he said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "It matters what they will do. They will not let you stay, not alone." He took a breath. There is another way, not his. The unspoken reference to Sterling hung between them. "Marry me, you will have my name. My roof. I will not expect anything, but you will be safe." It was not a declaration of love. It was a proposal of alliance, a shield offered freely. He was giving her a choice, not an ultimatum. He was offering protection, not possession. In his quiet, serious face, she saw not a hint of the entitlement that oozed from Mr. Sterling. She saw honor, a deep, unshakable integrity that was as solid as the iron he worked. It was a strange, stark kind of courtship, held in a stuffy parlor under the disapproving eye of a landlady. But in that moment, Elara felt a flicker of something she had not allowed herself to feel in a very long time. A sliver of hope. She was a survivor. She knew how to weigh her options, how to choose the better of two bad hands. But this felt different. This felt like a choice for something, not just away from something else. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and steady. "I will." The circuit judge married them 2 days later in his dusty office, the only witnesses a clerk, and a faint scent of stale tobacco. There were no flowers, no well wishes, only a brief exchange of vows that felt more like the signing of a contract. Afterward, they walked back to the smithy in a silence that was heavy and unfamiliar. The house that had been his was now theirs, and the small space seemed to shrink with the weight of their shared presence. The first night was a study in careful navigation. "The bed is yours," Elias said, his voice flat as he gestured to the only bedroom. "I will sleep out here." He did not look at her as he laid a spare blanket and a thin pallet on the floor of the main room, near the cold hearth. Elara watched him, a tight knot of uncertainty in her chest. She retreated to the bedroom and quietly latched the door, the sound of the bolts sliding home, feeling both like a betrayal and a necessity. Lying in his bed, the sheets smelling faintly of wood smoke and clean linen, she listened to the sounds of him settling on the floor outside. It was the loneliest kind of proximity. The days that followed were a quiet, delicate dance. They moved around each other, two planets in a new and uncertain orbit. He rose before dawn, the clang of his hammer a distant, rhythmic heartbeat to her morning. She would wake, dress, and enter the main room to find he had already left a pot of coffee on the stove and a fresh bucket of water by the basin. It was a small, unspoken courtesy that felt like a fragile bridge across the chasm of their strangeness. She began to find her own rhythm in the house. She swept the floors, her broom whispering against the worn planks. She organized the pantry, arranging his sparse provisions into neat, sensible rows. One afternoon, she noticed a long, L-shaped tear in the shoulder of his work shirt, which he'd left slung over the back of the chair. She took it to her room, and with her own thread, mended it with a line of stitches so fine, and even they were nearly invisible. She folded it and left it on his chair. That evening, he came in from the forge, his face streaked with soot. He saw the shirt, picked it up, and ran a thumb over the repair. He didn't say anything, but he looked at her, a long, considering look that held more meaning than a dozen words of thanks. Later, as she prepared to retire, she found a cup of cool water sitting on the small table beside the bed. A silent acknowledgement, an exchange. In these small domestic rituals, they began to speak a language without words, building the first, tentative foundations of a trust they both desperately needed. The heat of summer lingered, baking the dust of the street and making the air inside the smithy shimmer above the forge. Elias worked with a relentless rhythm, the sweat beading on his brow and tracing paths through the soot on his arms. He found his thoughts drifting from the iron in his hands to the woman in his house. He had grown accustomed to the soft sounds of her movements, the scent of soap and lavender that now clung to the linens, the quiet order she brought to his space. It was a disturbance to his solitude, but a disturbance he was beginning to realize he did not resent. One evening he came inside later than usual, his hands aching and stained black. She was at the table, reading by the light of a single lamp. She looked up as he entered, and her eyes went to his hands. Without a word, she rose, filled the basin with warm water from the kettle, and set it on the washstand with a clean cloth and a bar of soap. She simply placed them there and returned to her seat, giving him space. He washed, the lye biting at the grime. He was accustomed to being self-sufficient, to tending his own needs. This simple, unsolicited act of care felt foreign and deeply resonant. A few days later, he noticed her struggling with a dull kitchen knife, her brow furrowed in frustration as she tried to slice a loaf of bread. He went to the smithy and returned with a whetstone. "It needs a proper edge," he said. He took the knife, but before he showed her how to draw the blade across the stone, he paused. Her hands were on the table, small and capable. He wanted to guide them, to show her the precise angle. His own hand hovered over hers for a fraction of a second. "May I?" The question was quiet, almost a whisper. Elara looked from his hand to his face. His expression was serious, his eyes asking for permission, not assuming it. No man had ever asked her that. They had only ever taken. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. His touch was surprisingly gentle. His large, calloused fingers were warm as they closed over hers, positioning them on the knife handle. He was careful, deliberate, his touch conveying only instruction. But as he guided her hand across the stone, a current passed between them, an awareness of his strength, her softness, the shared space of a few inches of air. He could feel the fine tremor in her hand, and he eased his grip, a silent reassurance. When the knife was sharp, he released her. The warmth of his touch lingered on her skin. He returned to his side of the room, and the silence that fell was different. It was no longer tense or awkward. It was charged with a new, unspoken understanding. He was not just a protector. He was a man of honor. And she was beginning to feel something far more dangerous than gratitude. Autumn arrived with a chill that seeped through the window panes and under the door. The rains came, a steady, drumming beat on the roof that went on for days, turning the street outside into a river of mud. The world shrank to the four walls of the house and the glowing heart of the wood stove. Elias felt the cold most keenly at night. His pallet on the floor was directly in the path of the draught that snaked under the ill-fitting door. He would wake in the deep hours of the night, a shiver running through him that had nothing to do with the lingering ghosts of his past. He caught a chill, a deep, rattling cough that he tried to stifle into his blanket so as not to disturb Elara. But she heard. She lay in the warm bed, listening to the muffled sounds of his discomfort, and a different kind of chill went through her. The man who had given her his name and his home was sleeping on the floor like a servant, while she took his comfort. It felt wrong, unbalanced. The next evening, as he was unrolling his pallet, she spoke, her voice startlingly clear in the quiet room. "Mr. Thorne." He paused, looking at her. She stood near the bedroom door, her hands clasped in front of her, a portrait of composure that belied the frantic beating of her heart. "Elias," he corrected her, his voice rough with his cough. She swallowed. "Elias, the bed is large enough. It is not right for you to be on the floor in this cold." It was a practical statement, an appeal to logic. But it was also an invitation, a monumental step across the divide they had so carefully maintained. He straightened up, his eyes searching hers in the lamplight. He saw no pity, only a frank and serious offer. He thought of the warmth of the mattress, the proximity to her, the line it would cross. His moral code, the very thing that had led them here, warred with a deep, bone-weary longing for comfort, for closeness. "Only if you want," he said, the words a familiar vow. It was his way of giving her an out, of ensuring her agency remained absolute. The choice had to be hers. She held his gaze, unwavering. "I do." He gave a single, slow nod. That night, for the first time, they shared the bed. A thick bolster of rolled blankets formed a rigid barrier down the middle. They lay on their sides, backs to each other, a foot of space between them. But the air was electric with their nearness. Elias could feel the heat radiating from her body, could hear the soft sound of her breathing. It was an intimacy more profound than any touch, a mutual consensual decision to share warmth against the cold, both outside and within. Mr. Sterling did not take defeat gracefully. He saw the quiet, domestic rhythm Elias and Elara were settling into, and it curdled his pride into a venomous resentment. He saw them at the mercantile, Elara choosing flour while Elias stood nearby, a silent, watchful presence. Sterling approached, a cruel smile playing on his lips. "Mrs. Thorne," he said, drawing out the name. "I trust your arrangement is proving satisfactory? The blacksmith is a man of few words. I imagine the nights are rather quiet." The insinuation was vile and public. Elara stiffened, her cheeks flushing, but Elias simply stepped forward, placing himself partially between her and Sterling. He said nothing, but his gaze was as hard and unyielding as cooled steel. Sterling's smile faltered under that silent pressure, and he retreated. But the poison had been injected. The encounter left a tense quiet between them on the walk home. It was a reminder that their marriage was a shield, and that some men would always try to break it. That evening, the mood in the house was heavy. Elias was restless. He checked the locks on the doors, secured the shutters on the windows, his movements sharper than usual. He was scanning for threats, the old instinct rising in him. Elara watched him, recognizing the tension in his shoulders. He was worried for her. When he was done, he came to the table where she sat. He unbuckled the holster at his hip and drew out his Colt revolver. He laid it on the table, the wood groaning under its weight. But he did not place it in the center. He slid it across the polished surface until the checkered grip was pointing toward her. Hilt first, it was an offering of ultimate trust, a soldier's sign of faith. He was giving her the power, the weapon, his own defense. "He will not touch you again," Elias said, his voice low and absolute. It was not a boast. It was a vow. His eyes met hers, and in their depths she saw the full, formidable weight of his protective instinct. But it was no longer the detached honor of a stranger. It was personal. It was for her. Her hand trembled slightly as she rested her fingers on the cool, warm wood of the revolver's grip. She didn't need the weapon. The trust he had just shown her was the only shield she needed. "I know," she whispered. The confrontation with Sterling had dislodged something between them, like a stone in a shoe. The pretense of a mere arrangement was wearing thin, exposing the raw, vulnerable feelings beneath. That night, neither of them made a move toward bed. They sat at the kitchen table, the single lamp casting their shadows long and dancing on the walls. The rain had started again, a soft, persistent drumming that insulated them from the outside world. It was Elara who spoke first, her voice barely above a whisper. "He looks at me the way my stepfather used to." The confession fell into the quiet room, small and heavy. Elias didn't prompt her or press for more. He simply waited, his stillness an invitation. And so she told him, not everything, but enough. She spoke of a childhood where every kindness had a price, where a man's home was his castle, and he was its absolute, and often cruel, king. She spoke of her flight, of the years spent looking over her shoulder, of the fierce, desperate need to build a life that was hers alone, where no one could lay a claim on her. "My independence," she finished, her voice thick with unshed tears. "It is all I have ever truly owned." When she was done, a heavy silence settled. Elias reached across the table, not to touch her, but to push the sugar bowl a half-inch to the left, a small, grounding, physical act. Then he spoke, his own voice rough. "I was a marshal, before this," he said. "In the territories, had a partner. Young man, full of talk about the future. We tracked a gang to their hideout. I told him to wait for backup. He was impatient. Elias's gaze was distant, seeing a past she could only imagine. He went in. I wasn't fast enough to stop him or to save him. I carried him 5 miles, but it was no use. His wife was waiting for him back at the fort." He looked down at his own hands as if they were foreign objects. "I came here to stop failing people, to mend things that can be mended. Iron is simpler than people. It does what you ask of it." They sat in the lamplight, their pasts laid bare on the table between them. They were no longer just a protector and a survivor, roles they had been assigned by circumstance. They were Elias and Elara, two people marked by loss and solitude, who had found an unlikely harbor in each other. He looked up, and for the first time, he spoke her name not as a title or a formality, but as a recognition, a discovery. Elara. And in the soft glow of the lamp, she gave him a smile. Not the polite, guarded smile she offered the world, but a real, true, unguarded smile that reached her eyes and made them shine. It was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. Sterling's final move was not one of passion, but of cold, calculated business. He arrived at the smithy one afternoon, not alone, but with Mr. Harrison, the town banker, a man whose spine was made of paper and ink. They found Elias and Elara in the house, sharing a simple midday meal. Sterling held up a sheaf of papers. "Thorne," he began, dispensing with any pretense of civility, "it seems the loan you took out to establish this smithy is coming due." "All of it? Mr. Harrison has been kind enough to transfer the debt to me." Elias rose slowly, his face a granite mask, but a cold dread coiled in his gut. The smithy, his work, his penance, it was all he had. "However," Sterling continued, his gaze sliding to Elara, "I am a reasonable man. I am prepared to forgive the entire sum. A gift, you might say." He let the word hang in the air. "All your wife has to do is agree to an annulment and accept my previous offer. She can save you, Thorne. The choice is hers." It was a masterful, cruel trap. He was trying to force her to choose between Elias's livelihood and her own freedom, framing it as an act of noble sacrifice. He was weaponizing her care for him. But Sterling misunderstood the foundation they had built. It was not based on obligation or debt. It was forged in quiet respect. Elias did not look at Sterling. He did not look at the papers that threatened his ruin. He looked at Elara. His expression was calm, his eyes clear. He gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of his head. "No, you owe me nothing." He was not asking her to save him. He was telling her she was free. In that silent, steady gaze, Elara saw everything. His honor, his trust in her, the simple, profound truth that he valued her autonomy more than his own security. It was the only answer she had ever needed from any man. She stood and took a step forward, not toward Sterling, but to stand beside Elias. She looked up at her husband, her partner, and then she turned her gaze, cold and sharp, on the predator before them. "This is my home," she said, her voice not loud, but carrying the unshakable weight of conviction. As she spoke, she reached out and took Elias's hand. It was not a gesture of a damsel seeking protection. It was the firm, sure grip of an equal. Her fingers laced with his, a public and definitive claim. Elias's hand closed around hers, a powerful answering pressure. It was his vow, spoken without a single word. Sterling stared at their joined hands, his face contorting in a mask of frustrated rage. He had offered wealth and been defeated by a simple, silent touch. He had wielded power and been broken by a bond he could never comprehend. After Sterling and the banker departed, leaving a wake of bitter silence, the tension in the small house did not immediately dissipate. It hung in the air, a humming wire of spent adrenaline. The grand confrontation was over, but its echoes remained. Elara, her hands trembling almost imperceptibly, returned to the mending she had set aside. It was a familiar, grounding task. She pushed the needle through the rough fabric of one of Elias's shirts, her movements automatic. The needle slipped, and she hissed as a bright bead of red welled on the tip of her index finger. It was a small hurt, insignificant after the battle they had just weathered, but it was enough to break the fragile dam of her composure. Elias was at her side in an instant. He didn't speak. He gently took her hand, his thumb brushing over her palm as he turned it toward the light. He looked at the tiny wound with the solemn focus of a surgeon. He went to the cupboard and came back with a clean strip of linen and a small tin of salve. His touch was impossibly tender as he cleaned the pinprick of blood and smoothed the soothing ointment over her skin. He wrapped the cloth around her fingertip, his large, calloused hands moving with a practiced, gentle precision. The sheer, quiet care of the act undid her more than Sterling's threats ever could. This was the aftermath of the battle, not shouting or victory, but this, the quiet tending of a small wound. Later, the lamplight cast a warm, golden pool in the kitchen. Exhaustion had settled deep into their bones. Elias found her sitting at the table, her head bowed, the bandaged finger resting on the wood. He moved to the stove, and from the simple provisions they had, made them a meal of bread and cheese and warmed over stew. He set the plates on the table and sat opposite her. They ate in a comfortable silence, too weary for words. At one point, he picked up a piece of cheese, broke it in two, and held out a portion to her. She accepted it from his fingers, her lips brushing his skin. A moment later, she spooned up a bit of stew and offered it to him. He leaned forward and took it. In the heart of their shared home, under the soft glow of the lamp, they fed each other, an act of simple, profound nourishment for a hunger that had nothing to do with food. The threat of Sterling was gone, but the debt remained, a shadow over the life they had just claimed as their own. That night, they did not retreat to separate silences. They sat at the kitchen table with a ledger and a pencil, equals facing a shared problem. For the first time, they spoke of the future, not as a vague, uncertain thing, but as a project they would build together. "I can take in more sewing," Elara said, her voice practical. "Mrs. Gable pays poorly, but there are others. The ranchers' wives." "I will take the miller's contract for the new wheel spokes," Elias countered. "And the freight company needs repairs to their wagon hitches. It is heavy work, but it pays well." They talked for hours, their voices low and serious, weaving their skills, their plans, their futures together. It was no longer his problem, his smithy, his debt. It was theirs. A shared challenge, a shared burden. The house felt different, fuller. It was filled with the sound of their planning, the scratch of the pencil, the quiet hum of partnership. Sometime after midnight, Elias reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object. He had been working on it for weeks, in stolen moments at the end of the day, carving with a small, sharp knife. He placed it on the table between them. It was a bird, a swallow, carved from a piece of pale, smooth pine. Its wings were swept back as if in flight, the detail so fine she could almost see the feathers. It was a thing of simple, breathtaking beauty, a piece of his quiet, hidden soul. He nudged it across the table toward her. "To watch over our home," he said, his voice soft. She picked it up. The wood was warm and smooth in her palm, fitting perfectly. It was not silk or gold. It was better. It was a promise, carved in wood. She looked up at him, her heart so full it felt like it might break. She closed her hand over his, the small bird held safely between their palms. "Our home," she repeated, the words a vow. They banked the fire and blew out the lamp, leaving the house in the soft, dark quiet of the coming morning. When they reached the bedroom door, they stopped. The space had always been a threshold, a boundary. Tonight, it felt like a beginning. They walked inside together. There was no bolster of blankets on the bed, no carefully measured distance. There was only the clean expanse of the sheets, waiting. Elias turned to her in the moonlight that filtered through the window. His face, usually so guarded, was open and vulnerable. He did not speak, did not ask. He simply lifted a hand and gently, with infinite care, brushed a stray strand of hair from her cheek. His knuckles grazed her skin, a touch as light as a breath, but it sent a tremor all the way through her. It was a question, offered without words, steeped in all the respect and honor he had shown her from the very first. She had her answer ready. She leaned into his touch, a clear, deliberate, and wholehearted surrender to the trust he had so painstakingly earned. It was her yes, even freely and completely. He let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. His other hand came up to cup her face, his thumbs tracing the line of her jaw. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and in his eyes she saw a yearning so deep it matched the one in her own soul. The house was no longer a silent, hollow place. It was their sanctuary. The loneliness that had defined both their lives had finally, blessedly, receded. He lowered his head, his forehead coming to rest against hers. A quiet vow spoken into the small, warm space between them. "Stay," he murmured, the word a plea and a promise. And she answered, her own voice sure and steady, sealing their future in the quiet dark. "Always